Hello everybody on Facebook Live. This is Frank Washka from PR Week, and it's time for the weekly PR Week podcast. We have a great guest for you this week, and Kamyl Bazbaz of Pramana Collective. Kamyl, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me.
And Thomas Moore is here as well. And
Yes.
so we will get started recording for real in 3, 2. Hello everyone, and welcome to the PR Week. That's PR Week's weekly podcast for everything going on in the worlds of PR and communications. My name is Frank Washcook. I'm the news director for PR Week and MM&M magazines. And we have a great guest on the PR Week podcast this week. It's Kamyl Bazbaz, who is a partner of Pramana Collective. Kamyl, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Frank.
And joining us this week is also, as our guest host, is Thomas Moore. Thomas, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Good deal, good deal. So Kamyl, welcome to the PR Week podcast. I read that you're a Knicks fan.
It's true. I almost wore my Knicks socks today, but it's a podcast.
I was going to ask you how that's going, but probably worse than it was last night after the Zion.
I know. It feels like worse than ever all the time. Maybe next year will be the Knicks year. I don't know. It's interesting. I was sort of trying to anticipate some questions here and who would, say I kind of admire for their communications, and it's certainly not the Knicks. But they also don't have a great product to be selling, and they haven't for many years. But I do think Adam Silver actually does a really good job.
I do too. I agree with
comms.
you. And clearly the NFL people do too, since they're trying to
The
recruit.
NFL, oh God, that is a tough deal that they've gotten themselves into.
You can't blame him for not leaving, because he seems to have a good thing going with the NBA right now.
Yeah, and I think that leadership position as a commissioner, I mean, what commissioners are even liked in major sports, right? It's you're the principal of the school. You're not the sort of fun teacher, right? That's just sort of the way that works. And so the fact that Adam Silver sort of figured this out, and I think he is really talented at being able to be thoughtful but authentic. I don't hear him as a panderer when he talks, and he's constantly addressing thorny issues head on, and I think doing a really good job. And I think the way that he responded to the Donald Sterling stuff initially as sort of like his first month on the job, whatever that was really, really good.
Right, we should give a reminder that was the Clippers owner, right? The Clippers
Yes,
owner who
exactly.
was making racial slurs, I want to say, right?
Yes, making racial slurs,
Yeah.
just basically being an overt racist and racist towards his players.
Right.
I think despite the obvious horrible things he did, you don't always see action taken that definitively. That's been 2 or 3 years ago now, and you see the NFL still struggling to take that sort of decisive action against domestic abuse and other things. And you think of Donald Sterling, right? He had that press conference, and I think the next day was sort of removed. This sort of quick, decisive action. We're not even gonna go down a path of, are we gonna do this, we're gonna do that. I thought that was a really impressive move that set the tone. And, I think it's an interesting sort of segue to talk about Pramana, because at the end of the day, it was the move that he did that set that tone, right? It wasn't just the message. It wasn't just the right way to say something. It was the fact that he did the right thing that helped create his reputation. And that's kind of our approach to comms, right? And in marketing and brand, and it all boils down to who you are, your product, and what you're putting as your best foot forward.
Well, we'll get to more about Pramana in one second, but I agree with you on Silver, because I think also they're not afraid to say we can improve our product in some ways. And here's how we're going to do that, with the timeouts at the end of the games, or with, even things like the All-Star game, where it's an exhibition game essentially. How can we make this more exciting? And then they have the players essentially pick teams over the past couple of years, and I think it's worked for them.
I totally agree. It's the sense of why does everyone think you need to have all the answers all the time? And it's okay to be vulnerable in that sense, right? Or to say, the All-Star game or the draft, for example, right? The way it works, the lottery, not perfect. Might even be crappy sometimes, and tanking is a real problem, and we haven't fixed it. Why does that sound like such a revelation for a commissioner to speak the truth about what's happening and be like, I know it's a problem too, and I'm trying to fix it.
But it does feel like a revelation.
Yeah, no, and I think that is a really powerful tool, and it ends up taking away that sort of first line of attack that others could have against you, right? It's like, oh, well, why? You're afraid to talk about this. You won't address it. He's never in that position, but he's also afraid to just say it's a problem and we're working on it, and here are the 3 things we're considering and doing it. I thought this is now we're super in the.
That's okay. I'm happy to delay the official part.
This
of
is
the
going to be a wordplay here, but to get really in the weeds about Adam Silver, they're talking about medical marijuana now and weed in the league, and I heard him give an answer about this where he was like, I have changed my mind about this issue, and I'm thinking about it differently now given the progress that's been made on research and federal and state legislation. And I was like, that, who else is saying stuff like that? Like, I'm learning new things and my perspective is evolving, also without necessarily saying that he has come to a final decision. So I think that kind of transparency and honesty is really powerful at any time, but I think especially from places you don't always expect it.
Good deal. Okay, so more importantly than basketball, let's talk about you for a few minutes.
More important than basketball.
Just more important than basketball. So you're an Obama for America alumni, as are a few of your colleagues now, and so you were you worked on a regional basis on the 08 campaign.
Yes, so my story in 2008 is that I first started off working for then Senator Clinton in 7 states across the country as a sort of regional press secretary. So sort of, for each primary, as you go through the political calendar, you start to staff up your individual states. That's going to start to happen soon for this cycle. And it was sort of my job to manage both the press happening within states and also sort of help elevate things that were happening within states to the sort of national campaign and the national narrative. And then once Secretary Clinton then dropped out, I went to the Obama campaign and worked in Ohio, and then did the rest of the campaign.
A slightly competitive state.
Slightly competitive state. It's very interesting now to see it. People feel like it's more solidly R than it's ever been. But in 08, I mean, it was still, sort of like post-Kerry times. Like, that's the bellwether. So goes Ohio, so goes the nation, and it was a wonderful experience for me getting to work there.
And it's interesting too, in that so much of the buzz around the 08 election was that it was the Facebook election. And I mean, how did you look at it back then as somebody working on the campaign? I mean, were you thinking about Facebook all the time? Were you thinking about it as an integral part of every message? I mean, what was the thinking about it?
It is so funny. I remember when I was in college, before I was writing for the paper, and I wrote an article about your senator is now on Facebook. Like, how weird is that? And it was funny because Mark Warner was one of the first elected officials who's governor of Virginia at the time to have a Facebook profile, and he tried all this sort of tech stuff that, if we're thinking about it now, is just sort of table stakes. And to just sort of be on Facebook was this huge novelty, and I think it was really sort of groundbreaking then. I mean, it's 2 things. One, it's the way in which you do outreach to constituents, to voters through Facebook. And the other is via fundraising, and how digital has totally changed the equation on how much you can raise and how that worked. And I think, you certainly saw that between Hillary and Secretary Clinton and President Obama, where, you had Secretary Clinton who had a lot of a humongous base of big money donors who've been giving to the party for a really long time, going up against someone who also had a lot of sort of long-term let's say establishment Democratic money, but also had this amazing support online. And to seeing how those things in 2008 sort of competed with each other was really interesting. And now seeing that a big part of a success today is having some combination of both. And figuring out how to balance those things.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting too. I think about the Hillary announcement in 2008 with the video rollout, the very personable, almost Oprah-like. I'm sitting on a couch and I'm having a conversation with you deal. And that seems to be the go-to move nowadays, doesn't it? You know, the rollout video and...
The rollout video to me is something that I sort of, it's like entertaining to me that that's the thing.
Yeah.
And it's also, it's not an ad either, you know, like...
you would have thought we'd move on to the VR version of your candidate.
Or something, but it's interesting that, you know, it is so not... a, you know, let's say campaign platform per se, right? You know, I think there's an image of this stuff being about sort of policy and what you're going to change and do, but these videos are really all about explaining who the candidate is and making that emotional connection. Can I trust you? Are you authentic? Is this believable? And the best videos are really good at doing that. And I think, you know, you saw the one that Secretary Clinton did in 2008 and the one she did in 2016 were both really effective in saying, you know, having a little vulnerability as well, right? I want to hear from you. I want to listen to you. You know, I think the way that Secretary Clinton launched her campaign in 2016 of trying to do smaller events, you know, trying to get more, you know, it might be less people, but to spend more quality time with people instead of a little with a lot, I think was really smart and a good way to start to do that early positioning.
So who's impressed you so far? Who has gotten out of the gate well, just in terms of their announcement? You know, obviously the Sanders announcement yesterday has taken a lot of air out of the room, and his fundraising total's been impressive. I mean, who's caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just to talk about Sanders for a second, I think it'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out, because he is not the underdog anymore. He's not going to have the benefit of being the counter candidate, which was so helpful to him in the last cycle. Of course, I think a lot of people, you know, didn't see him as a counter candidate, just saw him as their person. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, all this stuff is about choice, right? And the reason the primaries are so difficult is because from you know, if you're looking at each party, at the end of the day, the candidates are not that different, right? Like what you'd expect from them in the White House, somewhat similar, but you know, you end up splitting hairs around a vote they had 20 years ago or something they did 30 years ago, whatever, because that's all there is to really differentiate them. So it'll be interesting to see sort of Bernie in this different position of almost an establishment, right? And I think also, you know, there's so much talk in the party and in the media about sort of when is the torch going to be passed, and you know, to what extent is, you know, Bernie, who has been in politics for such a long time, represents something like that. So I think that'll be an interesting challenge for him. I thought Senator Harris's rollout was excellent. I thought that they're doing a really great job of sort of coming out the gate strong and showing up in a lot of smart places, doing things in lots of smart ways that I think captured people's attention. But you know, at this stage, this is the super beginning, and they have to do a lot of stuff sort of almost behind the scenes in this stage to try and get to a place of success down the line. This is where you need to line up those endorsements in key primary states. This is where you need to start to build the framework for these local campaigns in those primary states. You know, go to Iowa and meet with party chairs and start to build those coalitions on your behalf, because that's what really pushes you over the line at the end of the day.
Now, I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction, but do you think we're going to see anything unusual as the primary process unfolds? I mean, look, we're already talking about 20-some people getting in.
I know.
Any kind of forecast you can make about what our viewers / listeners might
To me,
see?
the best time to look for that curveball is going to be when these debates start, because people are going to do whatever they can to get as much attention as they can from that debate. And when there are 20 people, you got to do something.
Right.
So what kind of swings are people going to take at others? What kind of differences are they going to try and do to make a contrast? Right? It's all about contrast at this stage. And when is it going to go from a band of colleagues to a band of competitors? That's always sort of the moment. And I think part of what we learned from 2016 from a party standpoint is, what do we need to do to make sure that doesn't damage the party's chances in the long term? Because the longer it goes and the more intense that goes, it ends up hurting our chances as a party. So it'll be interesting to see at what point it really starts to rein in.
Right. Do you ever miss it?
Absolutely, sometimes. I think, there is little work that feels so rewarding, just in terms of giving back. And I think I would encourage, anyone listening here who's, a young person thinking about their career and, where's somewhere I can go and learn a ton. And I think what's also fun about a campaign is that if you're good, you will likely get promoted and fast, right? So it's a 2-year thing at the most, and you can go from being an associate to being, a press secretary, and learning so much in that time. Where if you're sort of climbing an agency ladder or climbing a in-house corporate ladder, that can take a lot of time to be allowed in those rooms or be a part of those discussions, and there just isn't that time on a campaign. Where people like to say it's a $1 billion business that needs to be bankrupt by election day.
Right.
And it's true, right? Like, you got to run it into the ground. And so, like, if you're good, you will get stuff to do, and you will learn a ton. So I mean, when I talk to people sort of figuring out doing their career, I think it's a great thing. And I think the other piece of it is, I think when you're in-house, let's say you're in-house at a public company, right? You have earnings 4 times a year, every quarter. Those are your big moments. Maybe you have a product launch, maybe you have an event. When you're in the throes of the campaign, you basically have an earnings report of something on that magnitude every week, if not every day. And to be able to handle that pressure, to be able to deal with those things, is such a tremendous skill to have that, at least me personally, I believe can help you with whatever you decide to do after. So I definitely miss it, but I left on purpose because to me it was really important to understand how things work, on this side of the coin in the private sector.
Now, nuts and bolts question here: how does a young person get involved with the campaign?
Yeah, I think what's great is if campaigns need all the help they can get. So if there's a candidate you like, it is not that hard to show up at their campaign office and try and get involved. Of course, that's on a volunteer basis. On the other hand, I think they post jobs and have sort of more sophisticated application processes than they've had before. And I think part of it is try and just get in, and you'll obviously have potentially an easier time working sort of in the field than in the headquarters. Because not everyone's willing to move to Iowa or willing to move to North Carolina or Vegas for the primaries there. But if you can do that, you will learn a ton. And I think whether it's a job or starting off as a volunteer, there are lots of different entry ways in there.
Okay. So you did interesting work after you left the campaign trail, and then you worked with the State Department. You worked at USA. Those are really interesting posts, and tell us a little bit about what you did there.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this came up in a work context recently. The learning how other countries think about press strategy, marketing, comms, and specifically PR is absolutely fascinating. And part of my job was, when I was working at the State Department, was whenever a foreign president or prime minister would come visit President Obama at the White House, they would have their equivalent of the White House press corps traveling with them. And it was my job to kind of be their point of contact, to access the meeting, to get into the White House, and to really cover it. And so I'd work with the embassy and the sort of the, what would be that office's, the Prime Minister President's comms office to sort of figure all this stuff out. And learning about those differences to me was like a crash course in international diplomacy and communications on the most interesting levels. I think you understand what it means to have freedom of speech in America, where you see the kind of press that other countries allow or don't allow to travel with them. And you are super proud to be a part of a country that respects the press that much, or perhaps used to respect the press that much. And that to me was always really great when we have those sorts of discussions. And then just sort of what are the norms, right? It's interesting because, we have our, Chuck Todds of the world, these sort of very famous, well-known TV personalities, and the other countries do too, but they're not used to showing up at the, White House gate 3 hours in advance to go through security, right? They're used to being treated like rock stars in their own country. So making sure to give them that experience when they came to the White House was really important. And also just knowing what's the same about, having great relationships with the press, no matter what country it is, right? The same level of mutual respect, the same level of trying to be as helpful as possible, the same point of sort of honest and directness. All those things that can go into building a great relationship are also the same. But it was really fun. I remember one time, I think it was a country from Latin America that I can't remember directly, but basically it was really early after President Obama was sworn in, and it was still in sort of like Obama, famous person in the world moment, which kind of still is happening, but
it happened last night.
It happened last night at the Duquesne. But basically, this press corps, after an Oval Office kind of press conference, basically demanded to get a picture with him after this entire press corps. And we're trying to get them out of the room. I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen those clips now, and when the staff is like, "Okay, everyone, leave." And they were just like, please, a picture, blah, blah, blah. And he had to oblige, and he did it. And it was just sort of like a really interesting moment that I think meant a lot to them, but was also extremely strange. But just sort of things we always had to think about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was the shoe ever on the other foot? Like, did you have to travel anywhere and you saw it in a totally different?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I went to India. We did a lot of the summits abroad, the protocol office at the State Department. So, I went to, for example, the G8 in Deauville, France, which is in the north of France, and you're organizing bilateral meetings and press conferences and working with your foreign contacts there. And at the end of the day, it's just a blast, and it was super interesting for me to learn those things. And then I think you mentioned USAID. I think the USAID experience was really different in a way, because instead of what would be these like big sort of institutional government meetings, you're going to developing countries, right? Like my first trip, week 2 at USAID, was to Yemen. And we had to land, doing a corkscrew on a C-17 because it wasn't safe, right? And it's like, this is different than showing up on, like Air Force One and having this experience. And, but that work was so important also. And we went to Syrian refugee camps, and part of the challenge there, and just thinking about, what does this all mean for the work? Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, so when you are traveling, what does somebody in your position do in a case like that?
Yeah, and I think for the USAID piece, and part of it, the challenge that probably people might be interested in hearing about is, how do you get a humanitarian crisis covered? It's not political news. It's not, sort of a hot take. It's not a flashy headline. It doesn't relate to jobs. How do you get foreign news covered? It's hard, right? You have to sort of find entries in there. I think it's been really interesting in the Trump era to see things like what's happening in with the Rohingya and Myanmar sort of get more coverage, I think because of how the government is treating it, and because it's not getting the appropriate attention. So that's kind of a good outcome of that, if it's worth calling it good, and also it hasn't been prevented and action was not taken that could have been. So it's really not good in the day, but at least it's getting talked about. So my role was to really talk about, try and get attention for the work that we were doing in Yemen, for the work we were doing to help Syrian refugees, and it's twofold. You have two audiences, right, or way more than that, but in a really basic sense. You have the in-country audience, so you're working with the embassy there to talk to the local press, Jordanian press, Turkish press, go on Al Jazeera Arabic, that sort of stuff, and do that experience. And then you're sort of talking to your public in DC and the sort of policymakers and that sort of crowd to make sure that this money that we're spending doing this stuff is being done efficiently. So you've got two audiences here, and it was a really interesting challenge to try and figure out how to tell that story. And also the other piece is that the war story is more interesting than the development story. Even though I think we can all agree when we kind of think about it, the things that the development community does might be more sustainable and more lasting than the things, in war, you're sort of ending some kind of conflict, which is essential. But what do you do right after? How do you rebuild? And that's the kind of work that we did that often goes unnoticed. And for me, it was an honor to sort of figure that out. So I'm coming up with communications plans, messaging, different strategies to try and get that message out there and get it talked about. And a lot of it is about tracking down the people who care, right? Like there was no beat writer for the USAID. There are people who cover finance, people who cover foreign policy, people who cover the military. Somewhere in between there, you can generally find someone that cares about this and gets it. And if you can find that and develop a relationship and start to get the story out.
Really interesting. So you go to the private sector and you work for Pramana, which is a really interesting agency. Sort of sits at the corner of what you were doing before in public affairs and technology, and a really well-respected firm out in the Valley. Tell us a little bit how you landed there and what you do.
Yeah, so I landed there basically just as 2016 was getting off the ground. For me, I felt like it was a great time to try and do something different, because I basically worked in politics and campaigns for the last 10 years, and hopeful that Secretary Clinton would win and would have an ability to go back maybe at some point. Of course, things didn't turn out that way, but I'm very grateful for this experience. And basically, I think what really attracted me to Pramana was this idea that, communications, marketing, and brand deserves a seat at the decision-making table. A lot of people will sort of think to themselves, our comms are terrible, our reputation stinks, and it's our comm staff's fault. Sometimes that's true. Other times, it's your business, it's your product, it's the thing. And the most beautiful words, the best influencers, the best strategy can't solve that. I mean, this is a trite example, but like the Fire Festival, right, which everyone can't stop talking about. Talk about something at the end of the day, no matter how many influencers you got, it was a total failure on epic proportions. And so for us, our approach is to go in pretty deep with our clients and sort of ask those questions about sort of who do you want to be, where do you want to see yourself, what are those decisions as a business you have to think about to get there, and then how can we really set a foundation from a brand and then marketing and comm standpoint to actually get there. Because without that foundation, you're doing stuff on an island, right? Like you're I think some agencies who are potentially just focused on PR, right? Can you get me press? Sure, I can try. I'll do that, but what's that gonna do for your business at the end of the day? Like one story in isolation that is not leveling up to something bigger is not going to do much for you. You know, maybe you can take it to your board and say, hey, we got covered, and they're like, oh, they're doing so great. But that's a Band-Aid. That's a moment in time. That's not a change. That's not going to help your business in the long term. And so, you know, at Pramana, we get to have this approach where we're thinking about things that way. We're trying to set a foundation, and we're trying to bring a lot of the best parts of what are traditionally considered to be different parts of the agency kind of matrix, right? So you've got your PR, maybe you've got brand, maybe you've got marketing and advertising. We're trying to come across that because if those different stakeholders are not talking to each other, not in agreement in-house at your company, then it's not going to be as good. We can be that thing that sits on top that helps get everyone on the same page because we have a process that really focuses on that to create that sort of foundational piece of music that everyone can sort of sing from.
Mm-hmm. And we always hear about the Valley that there's almost a reluctance to work with anybody that's a comms firm a lot of times, just because there is like this technology companies sometimes see it as an authenticity thing, you know, where if somebody else is helping to shape your message, it's not you, and that could be a bad thing. Do you run into that, or is that passé now? Is that gone away?
I don't really. The challenge that happens often in the Valley with tech companies in particular is that they have a great product, and if it's very technical, then they have a hard time explaining it. Yeah. And I think, you know, you see a lot of founders on the startup side that can kind of get through the fundraise because being that technical can actually be really beneficial to raising money. But then after that, when you've got to, you know, put content together, you've got to start to think about your comm strategy and marketing. You can't have that, you know, 300-word, one sentence description about what your product does. That's not going to work. And so that's when we see a lot of folks come to us to try and translate that. I think the other thing is, you know, you've got folks who are really product focused and not necessarily vision or culture focused, right? So what are the core values of your company? That's a thing that needs to happen at some point in every company's growth. And so if you can hire a firm like Pramana that can not only think about your comm strategy and the things that maybe were top of mind, but also these foundational things that can set the company up for success, you're getting a lot of value from what I think might be considered as something really, really narrow. And since we work on a project basis, you're not signing us up for 5 years on a yearly thing or that kind of retainer model. You're hiring us to set you up to get our help in executing, and then hopefully we can sort of hand that off to folks internally who can continue that work, and then you don't really need us. I think what we found is that even though we're project-based, people end up keeping us on at a different capacity because you know, it's just helpful to have our advice as they're going through this. But I think, you know, sort of that translation exercise is one of the big differences.
What was it like adjusting to the Valley?
I mean, I think you know, at the end of the day, the adjustment was not necessarily as stark as I thought it would be, and I think a lot of people who make the move think about it that way. But I also think, on the other hand, you know, Pramana started off working with a lot of tech companies, and that was kind of our focus, and I think definitely a part of the DNA of the firm. But these days we're working with companies of all different types who are not sort of tech companies based in the Valley, as you would think. And I don't want to name names to protect people, but we're you know, working with everything from sort of like legacy children's brands who are in entertainment to you know, real estate companies to, you know, your others, just sort of big institutional companies that are not tech per se. And I think we're getting those opportunities, and we feel really fortunate about that because we have this approach and because we can talk to all those stakeholders within a comms stack, if you will, right? We can talk to marketing, we can talk to brand, we can talk to comms, and we can set up that foundational work and then execute on it, right? I feel like when you're looking at a lot of other firms that have like expanded into doing other things, they expand because they feel like that's what their client wants, and that's how they're keeping them on board. And so their expertise in that expansion is not as great as their core stuff. We have tried extremely hard to hire the best people and stay small, so that when our clients hire us, they are getting a really high level of service and a high level of expertise from people who have been in their chairs, who have done this work themselves, and can apply a ton of firsthand experience to doing it.
So you're not just working with scooter startups, in other words.
Oh no.
All right.
Yeah.
Let me kick it over to Thomas now for the news of the week. So we're recording this on Thursday, of course, which you know if you're watching it on Facebook Live, but you might not know if you are viewing it on the website or as part of our weekly newsletter. But Edelman's 2018 numbers just came out today. So Thomas, tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, they did, and they weren't really great. The global revenue for Edelman dropped 1.1%, and this is for 2018 on a like-for-like basis compared to 2017. 1.1% down to 888.4 million. That's globally. For the parent company DJE Holdings, revenue dipped 0.1% last year, down to 961.8 million, and the revenue was down across all the regions except for Latin America and Canada. Richard Edelman today spoke about it to PR Week, and his basic rationale for that was some missteps in Germany and the Middle East, mergers and acquisitions, some people leaving, but overall, his explanation was that the large brands have just cut budgets, and he compared the effect on Edelman of those cuts to the cuts that large ad agencies have seen recently, and also that the big brands and clients are bringing stuff in-house and turning to projects.
Yeah, and Edelman is, of course, a bit of a bellwether, so I think this is going to set off some alarm bells at agencies all over the place. And that if they're having if they had a rough year last year, other firms are going to start wondering what's going on. So.
Yeah, definitely. Although he did say it was a rebuilding year. Yeah. They understand what's going on, and he spoke a lot about their earned media approach, earned content. And that's a big push for Edelman.
Kamyl, what are you seeing out there just in terms of the overall business landscape? I mean, is it tough? Is it tougher than it was a couple of years ago?
I mean, I think what you're seeing from Edelman is, at the end of the day, I think evidence that model might not be what companies are looking for. Is it delivering the value that it always did, right? I think companies like ours that are disrupting the way this thing is sort of supposed to work and coming up with an approach that is really modern, that's satisfying these needs, that is thinking about how to do things more efficiently and differently, is probably the reason why that went down. I mean, I'm sure there's probably some deal that you're sort of referencing in the Middle East or something, but I just think people across the board are looking for new ways to do this. We're seeing industries of all types getting disrupted, and this sort of agency the agency is one of those industries. I think I'd love to say that Pramana took all that 1% and we're like moving to a new building somewhere for all 15 of us, but that is not the case. But I do feel like companies are looking outside of the big agency model for something different.
Okay, we will keep that in mind as we continue to watch this. Tell us about a new hire over at Edelman this week, Thomas.
Yeah. They hired Deputy Press Secretary Lindsay Walters. She's from the White House. She's the only press secretary to have been on the White House comm staff since the beginning of the administration, other than Press Secretary Sarah Sanders. And it's the latest high-level political hire that Edelman's had. Last year, they hired Joe Lockhart, and when Richard was talking about his results, he did say that public affairs is one of the strong points for the agency this year. So I think that maybe reflects it, in getting this kind of talent.
Any advice for somebody going from the hot seat of the White House to the agency world? I mean, I feel like in this case the pressure's off a bit.
I mean, it's interesting because I think two things. One, it's important to say that I think the question you're asking in general and the question you're asking from the Trump administration to Edelman, this is not apples to apples.
Right.
I
Of course not.
You know, and I think in particular because, and I'm not just, you know, Democrat and Republican. I think, you know, any Bush administration staffer, a lot of those folks have been extremely successful in the private sector, and a lot of them are extremely talented at what they do. But I think when your brand at the White House is basically anchored in lies, right? Like that is your strategy. You can say whatever you want, and you know it doesn't matter. I'm not sure that's going to be attractive to Edelman clients, right? So, can you do crisis? Maybe you've been in crisis, but have you succeeded out of getting yourself out of one? And you know, our client's going to want to hear, well, our trick at the White House was to create another. So I know that things are going bad at this oil company. Why don't you do something else? That'll distract them. Yeah, that's not how this works.
It feels a little dangerous to me.
It feels a little dangerous. Yeah.
Okay, Thomas.
She may not be recommending that strategy.
Yeah, but you know, I'm sure she had I'm not sure what she did before going to the White House, and so I'm sure she had a great career doing other things. But I think it's a tough. Not only is it a tough brand, but it is just different.
Yeah.
This is something that have been lying, have I think done things that I think as a country will be embarrassed about for an extremely long time, and something that she was involved in. So something that Edelman has to reckon with, and I think it'll be interesting to see how their clients that she's assigned to react to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We'll keep an eye on it. Thomas, tell us about two more People Moves to close out the podcast. One at Weber Shandwick in Boston, and one over at Amgen.
Yeah, so at Weber Shandwick, Julie Hall, who is the GM of the Boston office, left. She left in early January. She'd only been there less than 5 months. So it was kind of an eyebrow raising and an abrupt departure. She declined to comment for the record, and Edelman Weber was fairly opaque about it as well, but I'm sure a lot of people are watching what's going on. She's just the latest, you know, not too long ago, Luca Panetti, who was in charge of Weber Shandwick West, departed, and Ian Cohen left to go to PayPal, so there's a few people leaving Weber. And then Amgen.
And I think this is a really interesting People Move.
Yeah. Julie Golick-Brown is now Senior VP of Corporate Affairs there of the Thousand Oaks-based company. She reports to Robert Bradway, who's the chairman and CEO. And she's replacing Ray Jordan.
And I think it's interesting. And of course, Ray is a really well-known guy out in the industry. But you know, it's interesting when somebody moves from a different department over to the comms department. There's this immediate sense of, what does this person know about the magic sauce that we have and nobody else has? So you know, it'll be interesting to see how it works out. She of course has a background in comms too, so you know, she's no stranger to it.
I think it's always interesting, and you know, people in comms are always looking to get senior roles and would like to be considered for even CEO positions and roles outside of the comms department and taken as seriously as people from legal or financial are. So
yeah, interesting. We'll keep an eye on it. Kamyl, thank you very much for joining us. This has been a terrific podcast.
Thank you.
I would like to say I hope the Knicks get the #1 spot in the draft, but I'd be lying as a converted Nets fan. So
really? Oh man.
I made the jump.
I mean, it's hard not to these days, and they're playing so well. So I'm happy for the team across the bridge.
Thank you for that. Anyway, it's been a great podcast. Thank you for joining us, Thomas. Thanks very much, and
Thank
we
you.
will see you guys next week on the PR Week podcast. Thanks again.